Thank you, everyone. I'm aware that at the end of this block, and we're running over a little bit, and that lunch is next, so I'm grateful for your attention. This is advanced a couple slides too many. Okay. At its essence, lean urbanism is a manner for community building that requires fewer resources. By community building, we use a broad term that includes many issues that people here will be familiar with. It's physical building, of course, real estate development. It's the provision of housing that is affordable and attainable. It's economic development for entrepreneurs and the benefit of neighborhoods. And of course, it includes various social aspects that also go into community building. Lean urbanism originated as a complaint among architects, urban designers, and developers, and the complaint was that it's just too hard to get anything done. Every project takes too much time. The codes that they had to deal with are too difficult to interpret, too complicated. Of course, financing, when this originated, it was during the recession, and so financing was also difficult to get. The types of projects that they were reacting to were those like this. Town centers, TODs, these are projects that are by their nature just too big, too expensive. They took too long to get permitting. They required way too many resources. And they were hard for the experts who had been practicing for decades to accomplish. So they started thinking, well, okay, if we're having a hard time doing this, what about the people who aren't experts? And who are these people? Who is being affected? What types of groups? So we started thinking about who those would be, and a few came quickly to mind. The first group is probably pretty obvious, the young. There are a lot of talented architects, urban designers, for example, in my field, who are, as I said, very talented, but don't have their own firms. They don't do their own projects. Because they're young in the US, they're frequently crippled by college debt. Of course, there are just too many other obstacles. I mentioned codes, for example. They just don't understand how to interpret these large codes that have ballooned over the decades. Because they're in debt, of course, it's difficult to get finance. Many of them, therefore, are just employees at other firms. If not employees, then they may go into something like web development or art, because these are two of the few industries that don't require licensing and expensive fees. The next group that we identified were what we call makers. Many people, when they hear the term, think of people who work with electronics, computers, 3D printers perhaps, and we do include those, but we're also talking about people who work with their hands. Carpenters, metal workers, the artists that I mentioned before, cooks, people in the food services industries. They have a difficult time just getting their arms around the codes for development, for business permitting and so forth, much less getting their minds around them. And of course, finance is also going to be a problem for these people. Another group that is obvious is immigrants. It's important to point out here that we're not talking just about unskilled laborers. There are a lot of people who come from other countries and were professionals in those countries, are very well accomplished and completely capable of starting their own businesses, doing their own projects, but because of the complications of the system here and the obstacles, the barriers to entry that they encounter, are not able to. Now, all of these groups that I mentioned fit into the next group, which is the small. If we think about just about any issue, any aspect of this system, I mentioned codes before, I mentioned expertise and financing, all of these favor the big actors in this system, and they all unfairly burden the small. So in addition to those, things like fees, these are disproportionately burdensome on small actors wanting to do small projects. These people can't amortize time, for example, like the deep-pocketed companies and projects can. And regulations, I think a term that we should all familiarize ourselves with is regulatory capture. This happens all the time, and it's never by the small actors, it's always by the big. So this is simply stated unfair, this exclusion. It's very easy when you think about it to generate some moral outrage, some righteous indignation, and respond to it emotionally. But there's also an analytical aspect of this, which is just about functionality of our society and our system. What is the cost when these people can't participate? What's the cost to them, of course, but also to us as a larger society when they can't participate in community building? So we started thinking about solutions, and we narrowed these solutions into three broad approaches. The purpose is to increase participation. We're working to reduce barriers to entry that I mentioned before, and finding a way that this all can be done using fewer resources. That participation will hopefully be by many hands, many people getting involved in these processes, and it should be stated that we're not talking here just about planning, which has been the focus of much of the discussion here, but we're really talking about getting many hands involved in building places and businesses in their communities. One of the things that we quickly realized we needed to focus on was the issue of scale. And that, as I mentioned before, these large TODs and town centers were sort of the default scale, the default concept, and the default place that people want to construct. But what we're proposing is an alternative, not a substitute, an alternative, that all scales are needed, but there is a void here where the small project and the small actors, the small businesses, are neglected. And so we're wanting to offer alternatives to fill that void. These solutions have a few types of characteristics. They're small, as we talked about. Small requires fewer resources. It's faster to do. You see incremental there, and what we talk about, the reason we talk about incremental is in terms of units, a block being developed one small parcel at a time rather than as an entire block. This not only allows more hands to participate, but also is much better for preserving community character, which is often a very important aspect of community building. And successional is an important concept because, well, to define it, what we're talking about is something that it's related to growth. It grows at the appropriate pace, at the appropriate time, when growth is needed, and at the scale that growth is needed, and at the scale that growth is feasible as well. These types of solutions that we're working on have fallen into a few groups of characteristics. They're going to be low debt so that they can be done by smaller actors and cost less money. They're going to be low tech generally as opposed to high tech, which is very often complicated, more expensive, and available only to the larger players. Thresholds are a way of getting under difficult requirements, essentially. An example is if you want to build a multifamily residential place, hypothetically, keeping under X number of units may avoid triggering the requirement of an elevator or sprinklers or something like that, which automatically, very often, makes it too difficult or too expensive to do. Platforms are things such as associations, nonprofits, community development corporations, or they could be physical, like a market or a commercial kitchen, so that people who are wanting to start businesses can work together. Processes are more on the municipal level, relating to ordinances, guidelines, requirements for permitting, and so forth. We've gone past now our research phase, and we've moved into our pilot project phase, where we're beginning to put these ideas and tools into operation. The first phase was on research. You can go to our website, leanurbanism.org, and you can find many position papers and case studies. One of them is a paper and a video about pilot projects. You can get more information about it there. I'm just going to go over it very briefly here. Our approach in these pilot projects focuses, it centers on neighborhood revitalization. What we're focusing on is community building that is done from within. And what I mean by that is that it's not top-down, that it's done by the locals, it's benefiting the locals, and is bottom-up instead. It does, however, require cooperation at the top. We're going to be working with municipalities to change processes, change codes, change guidelines that are serving as barriers to this kind of community building. The purpose of these projects is to spur small incremental development, but also to spur local ownership and provide affordable places to live and to work. They're going to be in targeted areas that are small in size, think of roughly the scale of a neighborhood rather than the whole city, and of course another purpose is to actually develop and test these tools that we're talking about. Each pilot will have 3 phases. The first is an assessment phase. We have a tool that we call the Lean Scan that is used to identify these barriers, these impediments to this type of activity we're talking about, but also to identify and map the assets. And those assets could be physical, they could be financial, social, what have you. And finally, in this assessment phase, we'll develop the outline of an action plan that will be used in the next phase, and that is a workshop. We'll assemble the stakeholders identified in the assessment. That will include the municipality, and we'll work together in a policy charrette to create what we call a pink zone. We call it a pink zone because it's an area where the red tape has been lightened. And what we'll do there is we'll work with the municipality to essentially pre-negotiate codes, if those are impediments, guidelines, processes to allow this type of activity. And of course, during that process, we'll identify the tools that will be needed in that pilot. The third phase is implementation. This is where the projects actually come out of the ground. We'll look for local expertise in the assessment phase and bring in expertise if it's needed, and of course we'll test and refine these tools. The formats of the tools, I've already mentioned the platforms before. They're information which is know-how and techniques to get around these types of impediments. and plans such as building plans if development is the goal. Just very quickly, an example of the type of tool that we'll be creating is a developer in a box. If small-scale developers like Caitlin was mentioning are desired in the community, we'll provide ways for them from the beginning of a market study all the way through to property management. I'm out of time, so I don't have the time to go over the value of small, but you can see all of that here, and I hope that will be a focus for each of you as you think about the potential for lean urbanism. Thank you.